We're doing an ongoing series on Jewish issues, on Israel. Let's pick up where we left off last week. We talked about the influence, or what I would contend, the sinister influence of Shabtai Zvi on the Jewish people, particularly from Poland. So why don't you start there?
Yes, I thought Shabtai Tzvi is an extremely important character in Jewish history, and even though he converted and largely his life went to waste, you could see him as a bearer of positive things such as Zionism, and obviously ever since the Greeks started occupying and telling us what to do in Israel through Roman occupation or whatever, especially after the destruction of the temple, Zionism has been an incorporeal part of all Jewish religion. Possibly not in the biblical text because largely we were in Zion itself, but the post-expulsion rabbinic consolidation of Judaism, Zionism's always there, and it takes an eccentric character like Shabtai Tzvi to ignite that spirit in larger European Jewry. But you have this huge population boom. I've went into detail. There's a lot of dispute, like the Khazar theory or whatever the origins of the European Jews are. However, we know that there was a huge population boom in the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. They allowed us to set up our own towns that were almost all Jewish or partially Jewish within the legal system. And you had towns of tens of thousands of religious Jews, possibly something that didn't even exist in biblical Israel. So, when you have the creation of Israel, you have to note the origins of the Jews in Europe, why we were there, and then the mass amount in millions that are able to go back to Israel. And you could analyze Israel. I did a stream on my channel, just like what's the state of the power of the current IDF? What kind of technology do we have? Rankings, monetary figures, and separate that from the biblical narrative. I think most Jews like to correspond to the biblical narrative and the history and the connection to the ancient people. So, I'm glad you invited me back, and I think talking about Israel could be a direct connection because I interpret Shabtai Tzvi as kind of like the father of modern-day secular Israel.
Okay, I mean, I think there's some accuracy to that. I mean, you accurately pointed out that Zionism is a very integral aspect of Judaism itself that threads through every generation of people trying to make their way to Zion, which was obviously impossible, or virtually impossible, from medieval times. I mean, the Christians tried to do it. It was called the Crusades. So, for the Jewish people in diaspora to be able to launch a liberation movement of the Holy Land was virtually impossible. And that Shabtai Zvi, as bad as he was, I would argue, probably did contribute to the fervor of modern Zionism. And we have to give credit where credit is due. Sometimes evil people there can be something good that comes off as a byproduct of their agenda. But I think that one of the little-known elements of Jewish history around this time, maybe a century after Shabtai Zvi's heresy was exposed by himself because he converted to Islam, is that the underground movement of the Sabbateans, which did permeate in Europe and that did morph into the Frankist movement under Jacob Frank, one of his major disciples in the 16th century, that Judaism, normative Judaism, was at war with this, and that it was really a civil war for the soul of Judaism, one that went from that century right up till today. And it's a war that has not been widely reported on. One of the major, you have to remember that Jacob Frank was excommunicated by the by the rabbinic authorities of Poland, and all of his followers as well. But they weren't in a position to really purge them because it's not like the Catholic Church, which basically put Jan Hus and his followers, they burned them at the stake. Those 300 people that were burned to death. because the Catholic Church had armies, and they had kings, and they had empires, and they had control of nations, so they could do that. But Judaism didn't have that, so we were really, I think, subjected to this heresy, and that it fought for the soul of Judaism. Rabbi Jacob Emden was one of the major fighters for Judaism, and he exposed Jonathan Eberschatz as being a Sabbatean in the 17th century, and there was testimony that's very interesting around that, and it exposes the pervasiveness of the Sabbatean heresy.
Yeah, I give a parallel maybe to trying to build up our streams and talking about these important subjects, is that you could see Shabbatai Tzvi as just having a minor historical influence in the popularizing of these ideas. And then what we discussed last week was being big tent in including basically everyone, because historically there's usually just a small group of a few hundred, or after an expulsion of maybe the Spanish expulsion of a large amount of Jews that would have returned to Israel. But the infrastructure there would have been, we weren't going to go back and become farmers or something. There's religious pilgrims, and it led to a very small amount of people doing it, versus having this concept that Jews in exile, even simple Jews that don't have such a connection to Judaism, would have an interest in picking up and returning to ancestral Europe, ancestral Israel. Mm-hmm. But once those infrastructure has been built, one thing, there's profit in maintaining those itself. So if Frank is just picking up on this movement, dropping any of the possible religious elements behind what had been part of the Shabbatai Tzvi movement, because legitimately new ideas from Sfas and possibly Lurianic Kaballah and these type new discoveries that had been resurrected in Israel were being spread throughout Europe through Shabbatai Tzvi and his entourage. And after that information had been spread, the entourage wasn't worth so much. They kind of went back into the background. So you had people like Frank picking up on this infrastructure, just as a corrupt man, fundraiser type person, is like, well, as long as the infrastructure is still there, I could still fundraise off of it, mm-hmm. even though possibly, Shabbatai Tzvi, the infrastructure had largely been used for what would be considered righteous in the eyes of Zionism, that, the fundraising and religious fervor, that at least a decent amount of that was actually picking up and causing people to return to Israel, as opposed by the time Jacob Frank, there's none of that. And it's just, let's keep the party going forgetting why the party was called for in the first place.
Well, first of all, it wasn't easy to return to Israel even in the days of Shabtai Tzvi, although his entrance into Israel and his anointment by Nathan of Gaza proves that there were Jews in Israel, and that there was a community in Sfat and Gaza and Jerusalem and other places. So that goes to the Zionist argument. But nevertheless,
I'm saying the added point that the renewed Torah created by the Central and Sfas, the Smicha controversy, Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch, and the creators of Kabbalah Shabbos in many ways, and the way Judaism celebrated today, the author of Yedid Nefesh, Gaza, the author of Korriban, what was Nassim Gaza's teacher, and that European Judaism was just way behind, that it didn't have this information. So Shabbatai Tzvi, who actually made it to Israel, actually met the disciples, at least Nassim Gaza, who had legitimately been somewhat of a disciple of that new movement. And even though maybe they turned to corruption, the ultimate corruption of converting away, they still created this vehicle for that wisdom to enter into Europe. And if you say just, Shabbatai Tzvi, that's really all he did. It was just the wisdom, but the fact that he had people making those trips back and forth and was creating fundraising and even if they were largely sinful party circles where Jews were getting together to talk about Jerusalem, even though it was connected largely with sin, which maybe came of Jacob Frank. If you just had AIPAC, God forbid, minus any of the good intentions, and Zionism or whatever spirit keeps it going, would it just kind of devolve into a nasty orgy like mm-hmm. Jacob Frank? And you say, yeah, possibly.
Yeah, I get it. And So you're saying then that the Lurianic Kabbalah and the Shulchan Aruch of Yosef Karo, which is an extraordinary book, and it really outlines how the Talmud was put together and the basic moral and ethical values of Talmudic Judaism. It's a book that can be found in almost anyone's prayer book in the synagogues today, including in conservative, not so much reform, but it's something that I often will read a bit on Shabbos when I go to the synagogue. It's a great, great book, and that you're claiming that it was Shabtai Zvi that brought the Shulchan Aruch to Europe and introduced it to European Jewish circles.
Well, I mean, obviously, the sages had communication. Shabbatai Tzvi was not the first person from Europe to know what was going on in Israel and Sfat. There had been, the Ramah, the one of the major rabbis in Poland, who wrote like kind of the gloss on Shulchan Aruch. This is what Sfardim do, and this is what Ashkenazim do. But to the general masses of Jews, it was probably late in coming, and the influence, like just for example, people may not realize unless they're a historian in Jewish halacha, but take the Friday night Kaballah Shabbos service, and a lot of those customs, in fact, arise from what happened in Sfat. So, how did it become that European Jews who didn't have this, like, go into the field and chant L'chad Dodi, they never heard of Yadit Nefesh or Koribon or these type things that are basically commonplace in all of European Judaism, that was spread in popularity largely through the Shabbatian movement, where maybe the rabbis who had special access to these great books and responded back and forth and were deciding religious text. But your average person at that point may never have picked up a Shulchan Aruch, let alone the Arizal's Kabbalah, which could be used as a justification for this larger movement that included Zionist aspiration and working together with, so to say, sinners, because probably historically the general method of the Jewish community in the situation in Europe was when someone became dangerous to the community, they cast them out. And
right.
So the idea of the community saying, well, they're still a Jew, let's work together with them for the greater Zionist cause. That also could have been a concept of Lurianic Kabbalah, like the halach is he's out, you can't work together with him. But it's saying like, well, he's still a Jew, and kind of like the Chabad movement today, just saying, well, we'll go somewhere, there's going to be Jews, and we'll work together with them regardless of the current situation they find themselves in, where you could argue that idea would have came before Lurianic Kabbalah and spread through Shabbatai Tzvi, that before that, largely the Jewish community was insular enough where they just would have been like, I'm sorry, you can't be part of our community anymore. We can't work together with you.
Well, yeah, that may be. And there certainly, we could point to existing communities that might have done that, because communities in the Middle Ages in Europe had generally their own separate judicial system. That's where the word Kahala comes from. The Kehillah is the legal community that had their own courts, their own judgments, and some of those were corrupt, and that they would drum somebody out, on a pretext. On the other hand, a lot of times these judges, these judiciaries, these Beit Dins, which had legal power, they were quite lenient, and oftentimes Christians accused of crimes preferred to be judged before a Jewish judge, because they knew that they would get a fairer, maybe a little bit more of a lenient sentence, like the old shopping for judges kind of thing. So they had a reputation generally for being somewhat on the forgiving side and on the lenient side, and that a Jew who was a bad Jew in Judaism could always come back to Judaism and repent of whatever sins they'd been involved in. But you bring up the issue of the Kabbalah. And of course, there's a lot of controversy swirling and still swirling around Kabbalah and Zohar and whatnot. We talked a bit about this last time. I just want to elaborate by pointing out that whether or not the Shabtai Zvi played a role in bringing Kabbalah to Europe, and I think he probably did, although I think it was there before, the Kabbalah generally is something that in Jewish law and Jewish custom is to be used as a tool to understand the Torah and to understand what God had in mind. But it's a very specialized thing. It's something that really only qualified people are supposed to delve into. And I think that those rules probably were put together in response to the corruption that Shabtai Zvi brought to it. And that is that you're supposed to be, I think, 40 years old. You're supposed to be a person that is recognized as having a good character and having references and being a spiritual person and having a good record. Also, someone with a profession, someone with a family, somebody who's married with children. There's all these qualifications for someone who has reached the level of intellectual sagacity, but also spirituality, that they qualify to study Kabbalah and to understand its mystical and esoteric messages. And, but the problem is that you had people like Shabtai Zvi and his followers who were sort of throwing it open. In a way, they were like the Protestants to the Catholic Church. Everybody has access to the Bible. We don't have any restrictions. You can read it and understand it and interpret it any way you want. And that led to some real excesses early on in the Protestant Reformation, like the Anabaptist movement. But when you have Kabbalah that's just opened up for everybody, it becomes a dangerous doctrine because it does deal with very spiritual and esoteric ideas that open the door for evil, that can open the door for Satan. And that, this is something E. Michael Jones, for example, who is a scholar that you and I both respect, and he's been on my show many times. He blames the Kabbalah and thus Judaism for corrupting Great Britain, according to him, through various mystics like John Dee and others who were Protestant radicals and who studied Kabbalah, apparently with a rabbi, and thus mysticized Britain and controlled Queen Elizabeth I. And then he blames that on the creation of the United States. And he's got this whole conspiracy theory, which is completely cockamamie. Somehow anyone who is an enemy of the Catholic Church is Judaized. But there is a kernel of truth there in that the misuse of the Kabbalah can lead to some very bad things. Black magic, Satanism, they use Kabbalah. And we should keep in mind that the Kabbalah itself is a very important and legitimate and sacred discipline, but it should only be handled by people who are really qualified to do so, and that the corruption enters when it falls into the wrong hands.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not sure how much you want to, talk about overlaying issues of European history. Maybe just to go through very briefly a few of the ideas I was thinking when you were talking there to add some insight. Is obviously we mentioned the Chelmeki massacres, that Poland had a largely organized hierarchical structure to their Judaism. I think it was called like the Four Councils within the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and they had, the Kehillah system of kind of like local rule of a Bezdin of wealthy people, and then a whole regional system of rabbinate where you could have kind of like chief rabbis and coming to a single board of rabbis making rulings for the whole empire. That people ask me about Pilpul. We don't have to do the diversion unless you want. That Pilpul was actually created in Poland, that the center of Judaism was largely in France and Germany and Spain, and then only after the expulsion from Spain and some of the expulsions in Eastern and Western Europe comes the rise of Poland as the center of Judaism, and that's allows the creation of a huge population boom, the organized Jewry in that large, vast territory, and like the landhold system where Jews kind of, it's worth explaining the system of economics that allowed Jews to have huge population booms on the feudal territory, whatever. But Shabtai Tzvi has this huge infrastructure of this, just disenchanted Jews who, God forbid, their national empire had just been defeated. Huge amounts of us have been slaughtered, and our infrastructure is in shambles. Let alone with you compared to like the 60s or something, where you have all these gurus coming from India or places like that, and some of them might be, so to say, legitimate, and a lot of them are fraud. So at that point, you have all this wisdom coming out of Israel, and some of it's legitimate, like Shulchan Aruch and probably the Arizal, although some of it's tough to tell. Like, did people in Europe necessarily automatically look at the Arizal as legitimate, even though generally the Arizal's Kaballah has won out in modern Judaism, that was probably a sign of the time, just like Baal Shem Tov was probably just one teacher who created this movement, but was also a profession at the time of kind of like doctors who prayed for people and wrote out little parchments with special names of God. That the Kabbalah was always an integral part of Judaism, where the Kabbalah is basically the explanation for why we do what we do. And if you consider like the very Litvish Torah rigid, like the original Hasidei Ashkenaz of Germany 800 years ago, who mortified our bodies and fasted and all these things to remove the connection to the flesh, that they were probably also Kabbalists. But Kabbalah is basically just concerned with how God runs the world, how God interacts with the world. And you could have the hard rabbinic legalistic definition where doesn't matter how God runs the world or why God does what God does. The point is we have the law and we need to follow it. And occasionally there's cases where you have conflict in law, where there's two principles up against each other that could cause confusion on which way to go. And generally just to go with the sages of the generation. And assume in those situations, the sages hopefully have knowledge of what we'll call Kabbalah to lead the generation in that direction. And, but Shabbatai Tzvi comes on the destruction, which will be comparable to after World War I or World War II, or possibly the creation of the Israeli rabbinate today, where just opportunism that, God forbid there was a travesty, and you had the destruction of the networks of organized Judaism that allowed Shabbatai Tzvi to step in and create these huge networks of hundreds of thousands of people. In reality, like Kabbalists have been always able to do that. The creation of the Hasidic movement, like in Israel today, the Hasidic movement and the Yeshiva movement are probably two extremely fundamental things to modern Israel. And, those are both creations of this Polish-Lithuania empire, that other movements that arise possibly based on Kabbalah. We know the Vilna Gaon had a lot of books on Kabbalah, the Ramchal, and anyone who has the Zionist concept where it's saying, okay, like we're Jews, we're here in Europe, they have a pretty good deal with Poland, although there's problems. But like, we're Jews. We should be thinking about returning to ancestral Israel in the original way of life, or whether you take it from like this greater perspective that it's God acting through us. So it wasn't necessarily righteous people or factors among Jews. It was just God awakening up in the spirit of Jews. Like now it's time to go back. And in the same way, when modern Zionism starts, you have largely secular people who are just working off of this large infrastructure of millions of disenfranchised Jews across Europe that are like, I'm not sure about our lot going forward in Europe. They know they're a Jew, and this concept of return to the Holy Land, the reason you're having problems in life is because you're distanced from who you really are, and who you really are is a Jew who should be living according to Torah and mitzvahs in the land of Israel. And that's something Kabbalistically where you just accept that the leaders of your town, the leaders of your generation have good knowledge of this information. But it is some idea, it's kind of like speculation or prophecy, saying like, can anyone really know the mind of God or how current events are going to shape out to provide light on the community on how to go about these difficult choices we have to make?
Well, Doovid, I think that what you're talking about here is the divide within Judaism, maybe one that's always been there, and that is sort of the syncretic, mechanic elements of rabbinic Judaism versus the more mystical, faith-based, Kabbalistic elements. And that the ideal in Judaism, I think that which we strive for, and that which is embraced to varying degrees by most Jews, is a merge between the two. You have, on the one hand, you've got reason, on the other hand, you've got faith. I mean, E. Michael Jones talks about this when he talks about logos. This idea that faith and reason come together. Now, he looks at it as a Christian, saying that that is the embodiment of Jesus and belief in Jesus. I'm talking about it from a Jewish perspective, in that if you have, on the one hand, this legalistic element that doesn't really concern itself with God or with belief, but they're more interested in whether or not you shech the tree right, or, that everything comes down to like a legalism. That's a big problem. I mean, that's something that Jesus himself accurately condemned when he criticized the Pharisees, because the people he was criticizing were very much like that. And that's also a problem today when you get to certain tendencies within the very Orthodox community. They're more interested in whether or not water has the right hechsher than they are whether or not, you're engaging in moral and ethical precepts of the Torah. On the other hand, if you have the faith element, and in this case that's represented by the Kaballah, functioning without the law, without the moral and ethical precepts, then you have problems as well. You've got unbridled faith in anything. I mean, if you believe in anything, you believe in nothing. You become, that opens the door to Satan. So the ideal in Judaism is to have logos, and that is to balance the law and the ethical and moral precepts of the Torah and all of its commands with belief in the Lord our God and with belief in the greater questions of existence and purpose. I want to bring things up to modern Israel, if you don't mind.
If I add in just one clarification point, would be, generally most Kabbalah books, like Lubavitch, Rebbe, Hasidim, is centered around the rituals that Jews have historically performed in an explanation for, what is doing the mitzvahs like tefillin and tzitzis and keeping kosher, all the rituals that we do that occupy huge amounts of time have to do with redeeming the world. And the Kabbalah will generally kind of explain like, no, there's this deep spiritual connection. When you have a mezuzah on your door, it creates like, the spiritual shield or some like, metaphysical concept that thousands of years of Jewish mysticism have been trying to explain, like that the rituals that we perform actually have this profound effect on the whole universe. To taking it from there to kind of just saying like, well, can you know the will of God in this generation? Like who's the righteous and who's the wicked, who's going to rise and who's going to fall, where wealth and power are going to be found. And you could assume that the Kabbalistic experts might also know the answers to those questions through such profound knowledge, but that's could be extremely dangerous if you want to look in like influencing politics or like who's going to be the next pope or banking or these type matters, where you say that if the Kabbalists had the power, were they, somewhat prophecies knowing the way that God was going to run the world, or were they dangerously affecting world affairs in order to, so to say, hasten the redemption, which could also hasten the destruction, which might be seen in connection with like Kabbalists in banking or Kabbalists in world politics, that when you look at Shabbatai Tzvi, he's meeting with non-Jewish leaders, and that's dangerous. Like, okay, like I'm a Jew and I think I'm great, so I'm just going to walk up to the leader of the PLO and convince them to like have peace and come to all my terms. It's not going to work that easy. And so when Shabbatai Tzvi met the Sultan, he feared for his life and he cowered and converted to Islam, and that's very known. But the rise of modern Zionism is these great personalities who are largely sinners, much worse than Shabbatai Tzvi, almost all of them, that have somehow risen to become the leaders and spokespeople for all of Israel. And if you take a big biblical precedence, you could say, yeah, there were times where the righteous, whatever reason, how God runs the world, that the righteous, most righteous people are not the ones in charge. And that's just kind of a sign of, say the current state of karma, the current state of action reaction built up of the sins of multiple generations. Like, these are your leaders, these are what you deserve based upon your actions. And from our perspective as believing Jews, we have this long-term vision of Zionism from biblical times, and like the Torah is a living book that is basically alive, and what's happening in Israel and in the world is a continuation of the saga that we live our lives by. But at the same time, we've probably trained ourselves to be able to explain it in secular terms. So if you want to talk like GDP and the rise of the Renaissance and Enlightenment in Europe and these historical factors, that's also important. That might be the difference between me and you in a traditional yeshiva, where in a traditional yeshiva history isn't really valued, or criticism that might come from the Catholics. Like in yeshiva, they never brought up like what the Fourth Lateran Council, to understand a Tosfos. We never like, let's look up the Fourth Lateran Council to, see what was happening in Tosfos's time. That's more a modern form of scholarship that is somewhat considered heretical even in the traditional world. But having lived in Gaulis and exile, that there's actually quite a bit of value to those services.
Well, I mean, I think that traditionally and historically, Judaism has always interacted with the non-Jewish world, and people who isolate themselves, that's a diaspora mentality. That's a survival instinct that continues to drive certain communities, and I think personally wrongfully, I think it's mistaken. At the same time, I respect people who are trying to be observant, who are trying to worship God. Who am I to criticize that? I mean, they're not harming anyone, and they are spiritual. So, certainly more so than I am when it comes to observance, I'll admit. So
well, Kaballah literally means like the giving over of tradition, like Moshe Kibel Torah Messina from the revealed tradition that we receive each generation. So generally, like you mentioned, not learning Kabbalah till you're over 40, because Kabbalah is going to deal with these extremely difficult existential questions that cause even the greatest among us to go crazy, which is like rich dad, poor dad, and which is like leaders of the generation. Which one of the sages are dealing with the leaders? And it's like, well, how come Donald Trump is president? What caused him to rise to power? Versus just saying like, well, he's the paro. I don't know why he's the paro. But that we have the leaders of the generation that deal with these people. And generally, you would have to turn to the Kabbalists to explain that. Like your straight, narrow-cut rabbis usually don't have much dealings with politicians. They try to avoid them and just say, like Pirkei Avos says, it's bad to deal with these people, versus your more Kabbalistic types, like the Lubavitch Rebbe, and now, even modern Orthodox and different things that might rely on Rav Kook and these different things where it makes sense that we're meeting with non-Jewish leaders. And really, you need the Kabbalah to explain what's going on, or you just resign to kind of like a faith. Well, I did my best and we'll see how it works out, and I trust in God. But if you want anything more than that, you're going to have to turn to the Kabbalah. And if you realize how difficult the Kabbalah is to understand, I'm sure most Jews and even a lot of non-Jews have read a little bit about it, and because it's an interesting system to interpret how God operates in the world. To recognize the signs of the scholars or the leaders of the modern day generation, to think that they probably are either have divine providence, where it's not their intelligence or calculation that's leading him to make the correct decision, but it's some sort of divine providence, or that somehow in a calculation study ability, these people, like you think the Ramchal or something like that, like this guy really understands the Kabbalah, systematized it, can explain it, like the Lubavitch Rebbe, if you read through his writings, like he really understood these karmatic processes and dealt with countless politicians and businessmen. But at the same time, it didn't matter if it were billionaires or major political figures. The Lubavitch Rebbe was constantly talking about God and the halacha and Jewish law. There was no period where he's like, but this is a billionaire, so now I'm not going to talk about God.
Oh, no. His message was to help people know God, Jew and non-Jew. And that's, what the Torah, I think, commands the Jewish people. That's what they mean by a light unto the nations, to take on an extra layer of observance, and one of those observances is to live in the land of Israel, that tiny little speck of country, and to do so and become a priestly sect, to be a light unto the rest of the world, so that we can all know God. And when we all know God, then you have the Messianic age. But let me bring up modern Israel.
This will be important for why Zionism is such a difficult heresy. And like the Brisker Reuve, I think, said that it had to be a heresy that looks good to a Torah scholar. If it was just like a non-Jewish or...
You mean the modern Zionist movement you're talking about?
Yeah, so we'll see why Zionism is in essence a heresy, but why it's a heresy that's particularly appealing to believing Jews, as opposed to, a lot of the other heresies among Judaism are more particularly interesting to non-believing Jews. That the heresy of Zionism is particularly appealing specifically to Torah-observant Jews.
I completely and totally disagree with you on that and reject that. Zionism is not a heresy. Zionism is integral to Judaism. Now, we could talk about the modern Zionist movement.
Yeah, I mean the current Zionism that connects to the current state of Israel. Any Zionism, right. I'm not talking about Israel and the land being integral to our religion. I'm talking about the current state of Israel.
You're not talking about Zionism with a small z. We're talking about Zionism as in the Zionist Congress of Basel in Switzerland in 1899, whenever it was, headed up by Theodor Herzl. We're talking about the modern organization of the Zionist movement, and I disagree with you on that too. I mean, I understand that you get people in Jerusalem today, the Neturei Karta in particular, who reject the state of Israel, even though they live there and they benefit from it and they're protected by it. And I understand that where they're coming from a strictly religious perspective, although I think they're wrong. I mean, they're not, any Jew living in Israel, we talked about this last time, I don't want to get back on a merry-go-round about it, but any Jew living in Israel, whether they're observant or not, is fulfilling about a third of the precepts of the Torah just by virtue of being there. But the point is that the modern Zionist movement, it is true that it has to be viewed in the modern secular context, that it was a nationalist movement, very much like those which were influencing Europe in the mid to late 19th century when it germinated. And that is, for example, the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy with Garibaldi, Young Turk movement in the Ottoman Empire. These were all modern nationalist movements. They had a racial component to it, as expressed by Moses Hess in his book Roman Jerusalem. You have to view it in the context of those times, that these were Jewish leaders who had imbibed and embraced these modern ideas. And while they were loyal to the Jewish people as a people, and in the case of Moses Hess as a race, even though I think he was an outlier and he was always controversial and he was a Marxist, putting that aside, they viewed the Jewish people as a national people. They weren't interested in the faith side of it. In fact, many of them were antagonistic toward that. And, but nevertheless, I mean, I don't think that that's all that relevant. I don't think they were evil. I don't think they were as evil as Shabtai Zvi. They weren't advocating immorality and overthrowing the Torah. They were advocating to ignore the Torah, basically, and to look at the world from an atheistic, secular standpoint. And in that context, that the Jewish people had a claim on Israel and that they ought to take possession of that land and become a normal people, just like any other people, like the French or like the British. They were interested in Jewish normality, and that our mission was to realize our national rights in that tiny land, nothing more and nothing less. But that doesn't necessarily, and that includes David Ben-Gurion and all of the founders of Israel. I mean, there's no question that they were secularists, that they were atheistic. I wouldn't say they were hard, stone cold atheists. I don't know that, and I don't assume it. But they were into this sort of nationalistic movement. I don't think that therefore means that Israel does not have a spiritual side. It does. I mean, Ben-Gurion made a compromise with the Grand Rabbi Cook. Israel, there was a recognition of the powers of Judaism over things like marriage and kosher and regular aspects of Jewish life. There were compromises made in that way, and that there were always religious Zionists, going back to the Vilna Gaon and going back to the return movement in Russia, which preceded the Zionist conference in Basel by almost 100 years. So, both of those elements are true with regard to the founding of modern Israel.
We could put it to the most integral issue facing Israel right now in the breakup of Netanyahu's coalition, which, Victor Lieberman's party of largely Russian Jews refusing to join the coalition if the Haredi parties aren't pushed on mandatory military service. And the actual language in the draft exemption bill is that the service of yeshiva and Torah education is an integral service to Israel, and it's an exemption to serving in the IDF generally because it's more important. And it's saying I'm a religious Jew by keeping the halacha, following the religion, studying the holy books. I'm intrinsically doing a service to Israel that you could argue is the greatest of the service. And then when you have your secular, Israeli like Lieberman, who is representing a large amount of people that may or may not even, halakhically, so to say, be Jewish, and they're saying, we have served the state. We have given multiple years of our life to fight for you people, and then to follow the laws of the country and the business and the economics and paying large amount of taxes, and to feel that they are somewhat second-rate citizens to the ultra-Orthodox Jews, because the ultra-Orthodox Jews are fulfilling the fundamental tenet of what it means to be a Jew, such to the extent that, yes, Lieberman and his party does have to do all these things and benefit those people, because those people more properly are fulfilling the identity that the state represents. And that's actually the current breakup of all the things happening in Israel of economics. It's, this definition, and Lieberman will probably lose, relatively even his seats if they have new elections, if the Haredi parties will get more power or they'll change their mind, or even like Bennett being forced out for representing. So you have these immortal beliefs, like the wisdom of the Torah that was there when Moses gave it is the same wisdom of God that works in our generation. And like the Kabbalists say that the leaders have limited free will, that basically God just acts through them. So if it's Donald Trump, and I don't care if you know Donald Trump, it's just Hashem working through these people. And so the politics in Israel, whatever reason God ordained it. According to the halacha, almost all the rabbis of the time looked at Zionism as heretical movement. Like, you can't create a nation state based on Torah. That's not the way the Torah lays out how it's going to happen. And at the time, almost all the rabbis were against it. And, there were a few that were for it. And the war happened and the creation of Israel. And now most of the rabbis are working together with Israel. Right. And they could say, even though their fathers maybe had been against it, but that wasn't the regime that they were under. So, you're supposed to live by Torah. And so if you had been in Europe under, some sort of different legal system, and now you're in Israel under a secular Jewish system, you have to make do with the situation. And obviously, through becoming part of the system, you could see that Haredi Orthodox Judaism has somewhat winning out in even current democratic politics.
Well, first of all, I mean, the rabbi after 1947 and 1948, the majority of ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews became pro-Israel. Once Israel was a de facto state that was made up of millions of Jews who could be all killed if they lost control of their state, for practical reasons, if in nothing else, they became pro-Israel. And for other reasons as well, I think they did see it as the will of God, and that they recognized that there was a spiritual component, regardless of whether or not Ben-Gurion was observant. Now, as far as the modern controversy you're talking about, I don't really understand the Haredi argument in that. I mean, if you look at the Torah, I mean, King David was also a general. He went out and fought for Israel. I mean, the Maccabees of the Hanukkah story, they were military men who fought against the Syrian Greeks. I mean, what are they talking about? Israel is a spiritual state, but it's also, according to Torah and Talmud, it has to be defended. So fighting for Israel is religious. Now, I can get the fact that they want to have exemptions for some Torah scholars, but the fact of the matter is, and this is my understanding of what's going on in Israel now, and again, I'm not an expert, but is that they've abused that system.